Chapter 5. Bad Memories. As she screamed, dropping backward down the shaft, Sarah realized that her fall was being slightly impeded by things brushing against her. Large, thick leaves they might be, or some sort of rough fungus sprouting from the walls of this pit. Whatever they were, she tried to grab hold of one to save herself from the terrible smash she expected every instant. She was falling too fast. Then, by blind chance, her wrist landed smack in one of the things which at once closed firmly. With a jolt that almost disjointed her, she found herself dangling by one arm. "Oh!" she gasped in relief and felt herself heaving for breath. She looked down the shaft to see how close she had been to breaking every bone. All she could see was a long tunnel lined with the things that had broken her fall. She looked up. The doorway through which she had entered the shaft was very high above her. As her eyes adjusted to the gloomy light, she saw what it was that had caught hold of her. A hand. All around her, protruding from the sides of the shaft, hands were groping in the air like reeds under water. Her relief gave way to a sick feeling. She was in the grip of a hand with no arm or body attached to it, and she had no apparent means of ever releasing herself. Perhaps they were carnivorous hands, or like those spiders that simply dissolved you away over a long period of time. She looked nervously up and down the shaft again, this time to see if there were any skeletons dangling there as in a jungle trap. She saw none, and now she felt other hands reaching for her and finding her, taking hold of her by the legs and the body. There were hands on her thighs, her ankles, her neck. She shuddered and shouted, "Stop that!" Knowing it was futile, she called, "Help! Help!" She writhed, trying to shake them all off, and with her free hand reached out for a hold in a despairing attempt to climb away. All she could see to grasp hold of was yet another hand. Hesitantly, she put hers in it, and it responded immediately, grasping her hand firmly. With the idea of perhaps climbing up the hands as though on a ladder, she tried to free her wrist from the first hand. It was no good. Now she was more tightly held than ever, stuck in a web of hands. "Help," she whimpered. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned her head to see what it was. To her bewilderment, she saw that hands on one side of her contrived to form themselves into a face of sorts, with finger and thumb circles for eyes, and two hands working together to fashion a mouth. And the mouth spoke to her. "What do you mean, help?" it said. "We are helping. We're helping hands." "You're hurting," Sarah told them. It was not quite true. Fear rather than pain was what afflicted her. Now there were several more faces of hands around her. "Would you like us to let go?" one of them asked. Sarah glanced down the shaft. No." "Well then," said one of the mouths, "come on. Which way?" "Which way?" she asked, nonplussed. "Up or down?" Oh, she was more confused. She looked back up the shaft toward the light, but that would be kind of a retreat. She looked down into the unknown, unfathomable abyss. Come on," an impatient voice urged her. "We haven't got all day." "Haven't you?" Sarah thought to herself. "It's a big decision for her," said a sympathetic voice. "Which way do you want to go?" asked an insistent one. Everyone in the labyrinth was so peremptory. "I've got good reason to be in a hurry," Sarah felt. "I've only got 13 hours to find my baby brother, and heaven knows how much time has already gone by. But why are all these people, if you can call them people, so bossy? Come on. Well, Sarah still hesitated. Up was chicken, down was dreadful. Many faces were watching her indecisiveness. Several of them were snickering, covering their mouths with another hand. She took a deep breath. "Well, since I'm pointed this way, I guess I'll go down." "She chose down," she heard the snickers behind their hands. She chose down. Was that wrong? Sarah inquired timidly. Too late now, said one of the hand faces, and with that they started to hand her down the shaft. Not roughly. She heard them singing something like a shanty. Down, 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 down. Hand her down, boys. We'll all go to town, boys. Down, 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 down. Hand her down, boys. Never a frown, boys. Down, 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 down. And down she went, far down, until she found herself held momentarily above a manhole while helping hands removed the cover of it. Then the lowest hands let go of her, dropping her neatly down the manhole, and the last she saw of the hands was their waving goodbye helpfully. As she landed on the stone floor of a dark, small cell, the cover was replaced on the manhole with a clunk. In pitch darkness, Sarah sat down. Her face was blank. The picture of her silent face was clearly beamed to a crystal in the chamber of the Goblin King. She's in the oubliette, Jareth observed. The goblins cackled wickedly, dancing and prancing around. Their jaws gaped with merriment, and they slapped their thighs. Shut up, Jareth told them. They froze. Their heads twitched around to look at their king. A sly goblin inquired. Wrong laugh? She shouldn't have gotten as far as the oubliette. Jareth was still staring at the picture of Sarah's face in the crystal. He shook his head. She should have given up by now. She'll never give up, said a keen goblin. Ha! Jareth laughed mercilessly. Won't she? She'll give up soon enough when she has to start all over. It pleased him to think of his labyrinth as a board game. If you got too close to the winning square, you might find a snake taking you back to the start. No one had, and very few had gotten as far as this disturbing girl, who was too old to be turned into a goblin. Jareth examined her face in his crystal. Too old to be a goblin, but too young to be kept by him. Damn her innocent eyes. She had to be sent back to square one immediately, before she became a serious threat to Toby. And he knew the snake for the job. Hoggle, he called, spinning the crystal. Hoggle's face appeared in it. She's in the oubliette, Jareth said. Get her back to the outer walls. Hoggle cocked his head, grimacing. She's quite determined, Your Majesty. It won't be an easy. Do it. Jareth flipped the crystal into the air, where it vanished like a bubble. He chuckled, imagining Sarah's face when she found herself beside Hoggle's pond again. Then he threw back his head and roared. The goblins watched him uncertainly. Was it all right to laugh now? Well, go ahead, laugh, Jareth told them, with the simple glee that is natural to evil-hearted folks. The goblins launched themselves into their full routine of cackles and snickers. The keen goblin directed them like a conductor, bringing them up to a crescendo of malign mirth. Sarah sat on the floor of the black cell, wishing she had asked the helping hands to take her up the shaft toward the light. What could she hope for in this place? 4 of her senses sharpened in the darkness. She detected a little scratching sound. Who's there? Who's there with me? Her body was tense with alarm. Me, a gruff voice replied. There was another noise of scratching, followed by the glare of a light as a match ignited, and in turn set a torch aflame. Hoggle was sitting there, on a rough bench, holding the torch up so that he and Sarah could see each other. Oh, she said, I'm glad to see you, Hoggle. She was so relieved she could have hugged him. Well, yes, Hoggle said brusquely, as though he were slightly embarrassed by the situation. Nice to see you, too. Sarah went to stand beside him in the torchlight. What are you doing here? How did you get here? Hoggle shrugged and half turned away. I knows you were going to get into trouble soon as I sees you, so I've come to help give you a hand. A helping hand, Sarah thought, and shivered. She had had enough of them. You mean, she asked, you're going to help me unriddle the labyrinth? Unriddle the labyrinth, Hoggle answered scornfully. Don't you know where you are? She looked about her. In the circle of torchlight, she saw stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling. One rough wooden bench was the only luxury. "Oh, she's looking around now, is she?" Hoggle's scorn had turned to sarcasm. "I suppose the little miss has noticed there ain't no doors, just the hole up there." Sarah peered as hard as she could into the shadows, and realized that he was right. "This," Hoggle was saying, "is an oubliette. The labyrinth's full of 'em." She was stung by his knowing, mocking tone of voice. "Really?" she replied, matching his sarcasm. "Now fancy that." "Don't try to sound smart," he told her. "You don't know what an oubliette is." "Do you?" "Yes," Hoggle said with a touch of pride. "It's a place you put people to forget about them." She remembered her verbs in French class, and pleased with herself said, "Of course. It comes from the French word oublier, to forget. But you already knew that, naturally." Hoggle raised his chin to scratch it, at the same time letting his eyes roll portentously around the cell. What he had said began to sink in, and Sarah looked at the flickering stone walls and shuddered. To forget about them. Was that what Jareth was trying to do to her? Just forget about her? She began to feel indignant. It wasn't fair. He had challenged her to this contest. All the odds were stacked against her, but she had made a brave enough start. He couldn't now just dump her in here to rot, could he? Hoggle had taken the torch and waddled into one corner of the oubliette. He beckoned her to follow. She did, casting a great shadow across the walls. Lying in the corner was a skeleton, on its back, knees bent, head propped against the wall. She put her hand to her mouth and was about to scream, then thought better of it. She would force herself to remain cool. "You see," Hoggle was squinting up at her, "this labyrinth is a dangerous place. No place for a little girl." She looked at him. Who was he calling little? He nodded at the skeleton. "That's how you'll end up if you keep going. In an oubliette like him. Lots of bad memories in the labyrinth, I can tell you. What you got to do, little missy, is get out of here." "But I must find my baby brother." "Forget all that. Now, it so happens," Hoggle said, scratching his cheek with a forefinger, "that I knows a shortcut out of the whole labyrinth from here." "No," she said at once. "I'm not giving up now. I've come too far. I've done too well." He nodded, and in a smooth voice assured her. "You've been wonderful." He shook his head and made a sucking noise on his teeth. "But this is only the edge of the labyrinth. You've hardly started. From here on in, it gets worse." There was something in his confidential tone that made Sarah suspicious. "Why are you so concerned about me?" she asked him. "What?" Hoggle sounded aggrieved. "I am, that's all. Nice young girl. Terrible black oubliette." "Listen," Sarah interrupted him. "You like jewelry, don't you?" He pursed his face. "Why?" he asked slowly. "You've got some very nice pieces." She pointed to the chain of ornaments dangling from his belt. In the torchlight, she could not be sure, but she fancied that a smirking little blush was on his whiskery cheek. "Thank you," he said. "If you'll help me through the labyrinth," she took a breath. "I'll give you." She slipped her bracelet off. It was only a cheap plastic thing, not one of the special ones that her mother had given her, and which she wore when she was going out. "This," she concluded, holding it out to him. Hoggle licked his lips and eyed the bracelet appraisingly. "You like it, don't you?" She could see that he did. He also had an eye for the ring on her finger. That had no intrinsic value either, though Sarah was fond of it because her mother had worn it when playing Hermione in The Winter's Tale. So, Hoggle said. "Tell you what, you give me the bracelet, and here's what I'll do. I'll show you the way out of the whole labyrinth. How's that?" "You were going to do that in any case," she pointed out. "Yes," he replied. "That's what would make it a particularly nice gesture on your part." He held his hand out. "Oh, no," Sarah withdrew her bracelet abruptly. "For this you must show me the way in. The whole way." Hoggle snorted. "What makes the little miss so certain I knows my way through it?" "Well," she answered, "you got here, didn't you?" "What?" Hoggle clucked, shaking his head. Yes. But I told you, this is just the fringe of it all. You've got nowhere yet. Come on, where's your common sense? You don't want to go farther than this. Really. You've done all you can and more. You have proved you're a smart, brave girl, and you don't deserve what would become of you in here." He glanced pointedly at the skeleton, which seemed to be jiggling in the flicker of the torchlight. No, you deserve to be saved from that. I'll say that much for you. So, how about it? He gazed up at her with the eyes of a piggy shrewdness from beneath his sprouting eyebrows. She looked back at him candidly. Whatever his game was, he played it badly. She had to bite her lip to stop herself from giggling at him. "I'll tell you what," she said, narrowing her eyes. "If you won't take me all the way through the labyrinth, just take me as far as you can. And then I'll try to do the rest by myself." He looked disgusted with her. "Tch, of all the headstrong numbskulls I ever came across." Sarah dangled the bracelet before his eyes. "Fair deal," she offered. "No strings. One bracelet. How about it?" The bracelet danced in her hand, and his eyes were dancing with it. Grudgingly, he asked, "What is this, anyway?" "Plastic?" His eyes shone. Then he raised his stumpy arm for Sarah to put the bracelet onto his wrist. He looked at it there and could not conceal his pride. "I don't promise nothing," he said, "but," he grunted resignedly, "I'll take you as far as I can. Then you're on your own, right?" "Right," Sarah agreed. He nodded. His eyes were still shining as he looked at the bracelet on his wrist. "Plastic," he murmured, thrilled. "Come on, then," Sarah urged him. Hoggle sprang into action. He seized the heavy wooden bench, and with a strength Sarah wouldn't have suspected in his small and round-shouldered body, he upended it so that the seat was flat against the wall. Sarah was surprised to see 2 doorknobs on the underside of the seat, one on the left and one on the right. She was disconcerted when Hoggle turned one knob and the seat became a door into the stone wall. That's not fair, she thought, with a mischievous grin, because he was enjoying himself, showing off to the young miss. Hoggle walked through the doorway. She was about to follow him when she heard a crashing and clattering. Broomsticks and buckets fell out of the doorway into the oubliette. She grinned, recognizing the old broom closet joke. "Oh, damn," she heard Hoggle say within the cupboard. He came out backward and avoided her eye as he thrust the brooms and buckets back inside and closed the door. Still sheepish, he grabbed the other doorknob. "Can't be right all the time, can we?" he muttered. This time, he opened the door rather less boldly. He peered through. "This is it," he told her. "Come on, then." She followed him into a dimly lit corridor with walls of grotesquely carved rock. They were working their way along the corridor when a voice boomed, "Don't go on." Sarah jumped violently and then looked all around her. She saw no one except Hoggle, and then she realized carved into the stone wall was a mouth. Standing back from it, she saw that the mouth was part of a huge face. Similar faces lined both sides of the corridor. As she and Hoggle passed them, each intoned a deeply resonant message. "Go back while you still can. This is not the way. Take heed and go no further. Beware, beware. It will soon be too late." Sarah put her hands over her ears. The warnings seemed to be echoing inside her head. Hoggle, bustling onward, looked around to see where she had gone off to and saw her standing. "Pah," he said, waving his hand. "Don't take no notice of them. They're just false alarms. You get a lot of them like that in the labyrinth. It means you're on the right track." "Oh, no, you're not," a face boomed. "Do shut up," Hoggle snapped back at it. Sorry, the face said. "Only doing my job." "Well, you don't need to do it to us," Hoggle answered, and led the way down the passage. The passageway twisted and turned, but on the whole, Sarah had the impression that they were moving forward, if such a direction existed in the labyrinth, and she felt encouraged. They passed another carved face. "Oh," Beware, the face declaimed, for don't bother. Hoggle flapped his hand dismissively. Oh, please, the face begged. I haven't said it for such a long time. You've no idea what it's like, stuck here in this wall and with... All right, Hoggle told it, but don't expect us to take any notice. The face brightened up. Oh, no, of course not. It cleared its throat. For the path you take will lead to sudden destruction. It paused. Thanks, it added politely. While the face was droning on, a small crystal ball had been rolling and skipping down the passage from behind Sarah and Hoggle. It overtook them as they turned a corner, and they saw it bounce on ahead of them. A blind beggar squatted with his back to the wall, his hat upturned on the ground in front of his feet. The crystal ball hopped smartly into the hat. Sarah heard Hoggle groan. She looked at him. His mouth was open, and his eyes were staring at the hat on the ground. The beggar turned his face toward them. So what have we here? He asked. Nothing, Hoggle spluttered. Nothing, tra-la-la. The beggar rose up. Hoggle froze. Sarah gasped. It was Jareth. Your Majesty. Hoggle bowed so obsequiously that he was at risk of performing a frontward roll. What? He swallowed and smiled back haggardly. What a nice surprise. Hello, Hedgewort, said the king of the goblins. Hogwart, Sarah corrected him. Hoggle, Sarah said, gritting his teeth. Hoggle, Jareth said in a kindly conversational voice. Can it be that you're helping the girl? Helping? Hoggle prevaricated. In what sense? In the sense that you're taking her further into the labyrinth, Jareth said. Oh, Hoggle replied, in that sense. Yes. Oh, no, Your Majesty, I was leading her back to the beginning. What? Sarah exclaimed. Hoggle forced his lips into an ingratiating smile for Jareth. I told her I was going to help her unriddle the labyrinth. Little trickery on my part, he guffawed and gulped. But actually... Jareth, smiling pleasantly, interrupted him. And what's this plastic trinket round your wrist? This? Hoggle looked wide-eyed at the bracelet, which someone must have slipped onto his wrist when he was snoozing, and which he had unaccountably not even noticed there until this moment. Why, he stuttered. My goodness, well, I never... Where did this come from? Hoggle, Jareth spoke levelly. If I thought you were betraying me, I would be forced to suspend you head first in the bog of eternal stench. Oh, no, Your Majesty, not the bog of eternal stench. Oh, yes, Hoggle. Jareth turned and smiled at Sarah. And you, Sarah, how are you enjoying the labyrinth? Sarah swallowed. Beside her, she heard Hoggle's feet shuffling. Determined not to allow Jareth to intimidate her, she affected a nonchalance that she was far from feeling. She hesitated. It's a piece of cake. Jareth raised one elegant eyebrow. Hoggle's eyes closed in dismay. Really? Jareth sounded intrigued. Then how about making it a more entertaining challenge? He looked up, and in the space of air before his eyes, the 13-hour clock appeared. He gestured gracefully, and the hands visibly began to turn faster. That's not fair, Sarah said. You say that so often. I wonder what your basis for comparison is. Jareth took the crystal ball from his hat and tossed it back down the tunnel again. At once, from the darkness came a noise, a crashing, whirring, trundling noise, distant as yet, but getting closer all the time, and louder. Hoggle's face was a mask of panic. Sarah found herself instinctively shrinking away from the approaching din. The labyrinth is a piece of cake, is it? Jareth laughed. Well, now we can see how you deal with this little slice. While his mocking laugh still rang, he vanished. Sarah and Hoggle stared along the passageway. When they saw what was coming at them, their jaws dropped and they trembled. A solid wall of furiously spinning knives and chopping cleavers was bearing inexorably down upon them. Dozens of keen blades glittered in the light, every one of them pointing forward and whirring wickedly. The wall of blades completely filled this tunnel, like a subway train, and it would chop them into little pieces in the blink of an eye. And Sarah noticed with horror Along the bottom of the slashing machine was a busy row of brushes for tidying up after itself. "Oh no, it's the cleaners!" Hoggle shrieked and took off. "What?" Sarah was so terrified she was mesmerically rooted where she stood. "Run!" Hoggle's shout came echoing back from some distance away and brought her to her senses. She dashed after him. The slashing machine came clanking and trundling remorselessly on behind them. All it needed for the story to finish now was that they should come to a dead end. Around a corner, they found one. A heavily barred door closed the tunnel in front of them. Chapter 6. Up and up. Sarah gasped. The whizzing blades were rapidly drawing nearer. Hoggle was pawing pathetically at the great door and mumbling to himself. But Sarah wasn't listening to him. She was looking around for an escape. Above, below. She dashed along the side walls, looking for a handle or button. There had to be some way out. That was how the labyrinth worked. There was always some trick, if only she could find it. The clanking, whirring, seething, brushing noise was louder. She glanced momentarily at what Hoggle was doing. He was still just scrabbling at the door. It was no use trusting to him. What could she do? What? Her eye fell on a part of the wall to one side of the door that looked distinct from the rest. A panel of metal plates. She pushed at it and felt a little give. "Hoggle!" she shouted over the echoing din. "Sarah!" he answered, hammering his pudgy fists against the door and kicking at it, as though it could be expected to relent in the face of such frustration. "Don't leave me! Get over here and help me!" she yelled back at him. Hoggle joined her. Together they shoved with all their weight at the metal plates. "Come on," Sarah told him. "Push, you little double-crosser. Push." Hoggle was pushing. "I can explain," he panted. "Push." A panel caved in suddenly. They fell through the space it left and sprawled flat on it. Behind them, the machine slashed through the air just beside their feet. When it reached the great barred door, there was a terrible crunching sound as the knives and cleavers bit through the wood, spitting it out as splinters, which the whirling brushes swept up neatly. The machine was cranked along by 4 goblins standing on a platform behind the wall of knives. They were grunting and sweating with the effort of turning handles and working levers to keep the contraption whirring. The racket clattered onward, through the demolished doorway and off into the distance. Sarah lay on her back, recovering her breath. Hoggle looked down at her. "He's throwing everything at us," he said, and shook his head with a trace of admiration. "The cleaners, the eternal stench, the whole works. He must think a lot of you." Sarah answered with a faint, forced smile. "He's got some funny ideas." Hoggle was busy again, eyes darting right and left behind his bushy eyebrows. He clumped around in the shadows until he found what he was looking for. "This is what we need," he called. "Follow me." She sat up and looked. There on the floor of the tunnel they had entered, she saw the base of a ladder. It led up into darkness. "Come on," Hoggle was calling. The first rung was too high for him to reach, and he was hopping around, trying to jump up to it. Sarah went over to him. The ladder looked unsafe to her. It was constructed of an odd assortment of bits of wood, planks, and branches, patched together with ends of rope and half-driven nails. "Come on, give me a hand," Hoggle urged. She stood with one hand holding the ladder. "How can I trust you?" she asked, "now that I know you are taking me back to the start of the labyrinth?" "I wasn't," Hoggle protested, and stared fiercely at her with those piggy eyes of his. As a liar, he was so bad it was quite touching. "I told him I was taking you to the start of the labyrinth to throw him off the scent, do you see? But actually—" "Hoggle," Sarah smiled reproachfully at him. "How can I believe anything you say?" "Well," he replied, screwing up one eye, "let me put it this way. What choice do you have?" Sarah thought about it. "There is that." "And now," Hoggle said, "the main thing is to get back up." And he started again to try and hop up to the first rung of the rickety ladder. Sarah gave him a leg up, watched him start, and followed. At any moment she thought the thing might collapse, but then, as Hoggle had said, what choice did she have? Without turning his head, Hoggle called out, "The other main thing is to not look down." Right, she called back. As though it were a playground dare, she had to snatch a little look past her feet. "Oh," she cried. They had climbed much higher than she would have thought possible in the time. The wobbly ladder seemed to stretch down below her forever. She could not see the bottom of it, nor could she see the top. She felt unable to climb another rung. Clutching the sides of the ladder, she started to shake. The whole ladder shook with her. Above, Hoggle clung desperately to the shaking ladder. "I said don't look down," he moaned. "Or perhaps don't means do where you come from." "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "Well, you've done all the shaking you want. Perhaps we could continue." "I can't help it," Sarah wailed. Jumping around like a monkey on a stick, Hoggle managed to answer. "Well, we'll just have to stay here until one of us falls off, or we turns into worm food." "I am sorry," Sarah told him, still shaking. "Oh, good. She's sorry. In that case, I don't mind being shaken to my certain death." Breathing deeply and looking resolutely upward, Sarah forced herself to think of happy, secure things. Merlin, her room, lovely evenings out with her mother, multiplication tables. It worked. She gained control of her body and started to climb again. Hoggle felt her coming, and he went on too. "See," he called to her, "you've got to understand my position. I'm a coward, and Jareth scares me." "What kind of position is that?" "A very humble one. That's my point. And you wouldn't be so brave either if you ever smelled the bog of eternal stench. It's... It was his turn to pause on the ladder and control his shakes. "What is it?" "It makes me dizzy just to think of it." "Is that all it does?" Sarah asked. "Smell?" "Believe me, that's enough. Oh, dear me. You wait. Just you wait, if you get that far." "Can't you hold your nose?" "No." Hoggle shuddered again, but started to climb. "Not with this smell. It gets into your ears, up your mouth, anywhere it can get in." Sarah thought she could see the top at last. There were chinks of daylight above her head. "But the worst thing," Hoggle continued, "is that you ever get a splash of the mire on your skin, you will never, ever be able to wash the stench off." He was on the top rung now. He reached up, fiddled with a sliding bolt, and pushed open a wooden hatchway. Outside was a clear blue sky. Sarah had never seen anything so beautiful. Chapter 7. The Meaning of Life. Sarah joined Hoggle on the top rung of the ladder, gratefully clutching the side of the open hatchway. It felt like firm land after a voyage at sea. They were looking at a garden where birds were singing. It was surrounded by well-trimmed hedges, box hedges, she thought, and indeed they ran so straight with neatly cut openings in them, and turned with such precise right angles, and the lawn was so flat and tidy that the garden was like a green box, with a blue sky for a lid. But that was not why they were called box hedges, was it? It was rather formal, with carefully positioned stone monuments. On the stones were runic carvings with a few faces. More of those false alarms, Sarah decided, preparing herself for gloomy predictions. The hatchway through which they had just emerged was itself the top of a large ornamental urn, set upon a marble table. What a ridiculous arrangement, Sarah reflected, as they clambered out of the urn and stepped down to the lawn. Nothing was what it seemed to be. It was like a language in which all the words were the same as her own, but where they meant something quite different from what you were used to. From now on, she would take nothing at its face value. She looked with suspicion at the urn, and then down at the grass. She stepped carefully. It could turn out to be the top of someone's head. Hoggle spread his hands. "Here we are, then. You're on your own from here." "What?" "This is as far as I goes." "You—" "Said I didn't promise nothing," he shrugged callously. "But you—" "And you said you didn't need anyone to save you." "You cheat!" Sarah was outraged. "Nasty little cheat." "I'm not a cheat. I said I'd take you as far as I could go. Well, this is it." "You're lying. You're a coward and a liar and... He sniffed. "Don't try to embarrass me. I have no pride." "Pipsqueak." Don't say that. Hoggle tightened his fist. Nasty, double-crossing little runty, cheating, no-good pipsqueak. I said don't say that. His eyebrows beetled. She leaned toward him and whispered, Pipsqueak. Ah! Hoggle's body clenched. He bared his teeth, then opened them to scream. With his feet together, he jumped in the air, thumping the ground as he landed. Then he lost his balance and rolled on the grass, beating his fists in the air, kicking his stumpy legs. His voice alternated between growl and scream. It was you who insisted on going on. I said I'd get you out, but oh no, you're so clever. You knew better, didn't you? Well, now you're on your own. Good luck to you, and good riddance. He closed his eyes and rolled on the grass again. Sarah watched him, her mouth open in amazement. She had never seen anyone so angry, not even Toby. Eventually, Hoggle subsided and lay for a while, his eyes still closed, his body twitching occasionally. Sarah wondered if he needed some sort of help. She felt guilty. She had provoked all of that with just her one word, which was clearly more hurtful than sticks or stones. Hoggle opened his eyes. He did not look at her as he stood up, brushed himself down, and pretended he had enough dignity left to turn away with his head held high. Hoggle won't be coming back to save you this time, he informed her. Oh, yes, he will, Sarah muttered under her breath, and before he could get away, she darted forward and snatched the chain of brooches and badges from his belt. She had to tug quite hard to get it off, and he staggered forward. Hey, he protested. Ha ha. She held his precious jewelry too high for him to reach. He danced around beneath the dangling chain, trying to jump up and grab it. It was no good. Give that back, he shrieked. No, you can have it back when I get to the center of the labyrinth. But you heard Jareth, Hoggle whined. The center is farther than I can go. No, no. His whine had risen to a shrill whimper. Upside down in the bog of eternal stench, he said. His eyes closed, and he shuddered. Now, there's the castle, Sarah said in a deliberately matter-of-fact voice, one a parent might use to a child after its tantrum. Over the hedges she could see the castle's spires and turrets and towers gleaming in the sunlight, and she pointed to them. Which way should we try? I don't know. Hoggle had turned sullen. Liar. Give it back. Hoggle was trying to leap up and grab the chain again. Give it back. She ignored him. Let's try this way, she proposed, and walked smartly through one of the gaps in the hedges to an hedged alley. Hoggle followed her reluctantly, his chin on his chest. She led the way down the straight alley, and soon came out into another garden, very like the one they had just left. Indeed, it was so like the first garden that it was the same one, she realized. She went to the urn and lifted the lid to check. Yes, there was the ladder leading downward. She frowned. Isn't this the place we just came from? Hoggle was paying no attention to anything but his string of bubbles. You. He leaped, but could get no more than half an inch off the ground. Give it back, he bellowed. I'm sure it's the same place. Sarah stared at the hedges and decided to try another gap. Come on, she told Hoggle. Let's try down here. He trotted miserably after her. Again, the alleyway ran geometrically straight, at a right angle, to the hedge bordering the garden, and again, within a few strides, they emerged into a garden so very like... Sarah groaned. Oh no. They had come out through a gap directly facing the one they had entered. Give me my things. Hoggle was trying on a tone of menace. It was easy to ignore. Come on, Sarah said, undaunted, and tried a different gap. The result was the same as before. They were facing the gap they had entered, and Hoggle was watching nothing but his jewelry. Sarah scratched her head. I don't believe it, she muttered, and looked around the garden. Which one haven't we tried? Hoggle pointed at a gap. Well, let's try that one then. She plunged into the gap. This time, Hoggle didn't follow her, but waited, arms folded on the lawn. It was only a moment before she reappeared. Oh, she groaned. It's impossible. She's so clever, is she? Hoggle sneered.
thinks she can do it all, and she's lost before she's even started.
Sarah turned on him. There's no point in sounding so smug. If you don't help me, you won't get your stuff back.
But
Hoggle's face fell.
I don't know which way to go,
he admitted. Then you'll have to help in some other way, won't you?
Them's my rightful property,
Hoggle complained.
It's not fair.
No, it isn't, Sarah conceded. She found herself smiling, and it took her a moment to realize why. Then she saw it, like a conundrum that would never fool her again. Nothing was fair. If you expected fairness, you would be forever disappointed. She turned a broad grin upon Hoggle. That's the way it is. At that moment, she spotted a curious robed figure strolling across the lawn, apparently deep in thought. Where had he come from? He was an old man with a long white mustache and white eyebrows, but the most striking thing about him was his hat, which was topped with the head of a bird with a sharp beak and eyes that were darting glances everywhere. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, running across the lawn after the old man. With his slow stride, furrowed brow, bent head, and hands clasped behind his back, he appeared very wise. Surely he could be of more help to her than the runty pipsqueak she had to rely upon until now. He was settling gravely down on a garden bench as she approached. "Please," she said, "can you help me?" The wise man didn't really register Sarah's presence. It was true that he raised his face toward her, but only as one might gaze at a tree, a fly, or a cloud while lost in thought. Rather than her, he seemed to be seeing a far horizon beyond her, so far beyond the few mortals had ever scanned it. The depth and range of his thinking was clearly vast, whatever the subject of his thoughts might be. He was probably pondering deeply upon some problem that Sarah had never even imagined. Was it mathematical, she wondered, like the square root of -2? Or philosophical, the meaning of meaning, perhaps? But no, those were things she'd at least tried to imagine when she read about them. Those great eyes gazing right through her were more likely preoccupied with some question of physics or biochemistry, or linguistics, or all of that at once, and more. "Please," she repeated timidly. The bird's head on the wise man's hat suddenly spoke.
Go away. Can't you see he's thinking?
The wise man slowly raised a finger and rolled his eyes up toward the bird and spoke. "Shh," he said. Sarah closed her mouth apologetically. She stood aside and waited. "And don't stare," the hat reprimanded her. "You'll put him off." "I'm sorry." The wise man's lips opened slowly and his eyes turned upward again to address the hat.
"Silence,"
he commanded. The hat looked wryly at Sarah.
"This is the thanks I get,"
it said disgustedly.
"Where was I?"
the wise man was asking.
"How should I know?" the hat chirped. "You're the big thinker."
The wise man noticed Sarah.
"Ah, a young girl."
Sarah returned a polite little smile. The wise man's gaze traveled downward and settled on Hoggle.
"And this is your brother?"
"Oh, no," Sarah answered. "He's just a friend." Hoggle had been about to expostulate about being taken for Sarah's brother. But now he stopped and looked sideways at Sarah. It was the first time anyone had called him a friend. He frowned. The wise man took a long breath.
"And what can I do for you?"
he asked Sarah. "Please," she said, feeling shy and a little confused to be conversing with an ancient sage about what must seem to him so trivial a matter. "Can you tell me, that is, I must get to the castle, but I can't even get out of this garden. Every time I try to leave, I find myself back here again. I can see the castle over there, but can you tell me, please, how I can get into it?"
"Ah,"
the wise man nodded, closing his eyes. After a while he said,
"So you want to get to the castle?"
"How's that for brain power?" demanded the bright-eyed hat.
"Quiet,"
the wise man commanded. "Nuts," the hat replied. Sarah put a hand over her mouth to conceal a giggle. The wise man composed his hands together on his lap.
"So, young woman,"
he told her, pursing his lips in thought. Nodding, he explained,
"the way forward is sometimes the way back."
His hat pulled a face. Will you listen to this crap? The wise man was glaring upward and clenching his fingers. He cleared his throat.
And sometimes,
He continued, gazing earnestly at Sarah again,
the way backward
is the way forward, the hat interrupted. Can you believe it? I ask you.
Will you be quiet?
The wise man ordered his hat profoundly. He looked again at Sarah.
Quite often, young lady, it seems we're not getting anywhere, when in fact we are.
Sarah looked despairingly around the garden. Well, I'm certainly not getting anywhere at the moment. Join the club, said the hat.
Perhaps,
The wise man said.
perhaps it only seems like that. All is not always what.
It appeared that he was drifting off into a reverie, on the nature of good and evil possibly, or four-dimensional calculus, and he only just made it to the end of his sentence.
It seems.
The hat peered down over the wise man's forehead, then looked perkily up at Sarah and Hoggle. I think that's your lot, the hat said. The total sum of earthly wisdom strewn at your feet for the asking. Please leave a contribution in the little box. Sarah noticed for the first time that the wise man had absent-mindedly drawn a collection box with a slot from the folds of his robe, and now was sitting, quite abstracted, in contemplation with the box on his knee. As she looked at it, he gave it a discreet little shake. What was she to do? She hesitated, then had the idea of donating one of the badges from Hoggle's string, which she was still holding. He read her mind. Don't you dare, Hoggle barked. Them's mine. Sarah paused, and finally slid her mother's costume ring off her finger. Hoggle watched her drop it in the collecting box, and looked green. He thought he was going to get that, too. Thank you kindly, the hat said, sounding like a fairground barker. Move along, please. As they walked away across the garden, Hoggle said, You didn't have to give that away. He didn't tell you nothing. Well, Sarah said reflectively, he said something about the way forward being sometimes the way backward. We haven't gotten anywhere so far trying to go out forward, so why don't we try walking out backward? It might work. Hoggle's expression was skeptical, but he humored her by doing as she suggested. They walked backward through the gap in the hedge from which Sarah had last emerged, and the garden remained in peaceful silence, decorated with birdsong. The hat was watching where they had gone. When they did not return, it chirped, Well, what do you know? They took your advice. The wise man had dozed off after having so much mental travail. His hat cocked an eye down at him. It's so stimulating being your hat,